Foundationalism. Throughout the history of epistemology, most epistemologists accepted that there would be some self-evident first principles. And typically these are things that you could just immediately know. To understand them is to know they're true, and that they would be enough to provide a foundation to build up a system of knowledge. One of the earliest examples we looked at, of course, is our good dead friend Plato. And his principles were the forms, and we have this latent knowledge of the forms that we've acquired, either before life or after death, however you want to look at it, and we have them within our minds. There's also our good dead friends Aristotle and Aquinas, and they regarded the basic truths such as mathematical axioms, logical axioms, would be grasped immediately by the understanding. So again, the idea is that as soon as you understand something, you would know it, and you would see its truth. According to our good dead friend Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, he claimed truth can come into the mind in two basic ways. One is, as known in itself, and secondly, would be a truth known through another, understood by the intellect, not immediately, but through an inquiry of reason, of which it is the terminus. In other words, you go through a series of steps. And so these are approaches that would be labeled now as foundationalism, because you have a foundation. Now, perhaps the most famous explicit foundationalist is our good dead friend René Descartes. And as I mentioned when we last left our good dead friend Descartes, before he died, he's at the end of Meditation 1, doubting his senses, thinking this all could be a dream, considering that God may be allowing him to be deceived, and perhaps worst of all, considering that it may be just him and the evil demon. So what is classical, also known as Cartesian foundationalism, so called because of course, our good dead friend Descartes? For the classical foundationalists, they accept that we can have infallible knowledge, and this knowledge is non-inferential. In other words, we don't have to go through a series of reasoning steps to get to it. So the infallible part means we can't be wrong. The non-inferential means that we don't have to go through steps like doing a proof to get to it. And these are called foundational beliefs because they serve as a foundation for all the knowledge. So whatever we know is either a foundational belief, we just know infallibly without inference, or we infer from the basic beliefs to something else. And I mentioned the term before, philosophers talking about being properly basic, which may sound like an insult. Like if you said to someone, you are indeed properly basic, it may sound somewhat insulting, but in this case, it would not be. So a properly basic belief is justified non-inferentially. It's just justified. It doesn't require a step to justify it. Non-basic justified belief must be based on inference from one, possibly more, of the properly basic beliefs. And this relationship is asymmetrical. So the basic beliefs justify the inferred beliefs, but the opposite doesn't hold. So it goes one way. Now we return back to our good dead friend Descartes. So how does he get out of his, or think he gets out of his problem? And if you want to see sort of the full details of this, because he goes through 5 meditations to get to this this point, so this is the super condensed version, we cover all of the meditations in the epistemology class. So what's the short version? Well, here it is. So as we saw back in the ancient days of looking at the meditations, Descartes' goals in the meditations were these. First, he wanted to tear down the rickety superstructure of sciences and philosophy and destroy the cracked, crappy foundation of our unjustified beliefs. And the whole point of this was for his new construction project. So he's got a rickety old house on a broken foundation, and he's going to, plow that out of the way. And his goal is to find a new foundation that's infallible. In other words, it cannot be doubted. So once he builds this foundation with propositions, claims that cannot be doubted, the next step would be to build upon that the superstructure, the house of knowledge. And if you use deductive reasoning from, beliefs that are certain, claims that are absolutely known to be true, then you might recall from our argument basics, valid argument plus two premises gives you true conclusion. Be a sound argument. So that would give us knowledge. So how does he do this? Well, again, we left Descartes in the clutches of the demon. And so, long story short, 5 meditations cut down to minutes. Here's what he does. Descartes comes up with what he regards as indubitable basic principles, ones that cannot be doubted. And they're pretty problematic. If you take the epistemology class, you'll see them in all their details and all their problems. And what he thinks he does is this. He thinks he deduces God's existence. The next step is that he deduces that God is benevolent, all good, and that God is not a deceiver. So, if God is all good and not a deceiver, since he gave us our senses, our perceptual mechanisms, he says we can know we're not being deceived when we believe things about objects in the world. So going back to kind of his dream problem, how do you know you're not dreaming? Well, he says normally what you see is real. So right now, listening to this video, it is probably not a dream. But he does end up in a bit of a problem here because he has to acknowledge that we can get things wrong. So he gets in kind of a paradox. He needs certainty, but he also has to account for how we can be mistaken, because we obviously can. So what he claims is this. Only under abnormal circumstances will we be deceived, such as, obvious ones, optical illusions, and the usual things from, critical thinking that interfere with our perceptions. Things like, being tired, the influence of, alcohol, etc., biases. Now, because we can be deceived, and here comes a bit of the problem, knowledge cannot be attributed to these empirical judgments, because we could be wrong. So for Descartes, put into, technical terms of logic, induction can never be a means of knowledge, only belief. And so, aside from the indubitable basic principles that we just see their truth somehow, the only path to actual knowledge is deduction, which is what he claimed. But he also has to leave in induction, because it's obviously something we use and we obviously can be wrong. And this creates some problems. So why do we not have a huge statue, of Descartes saying, here's the guy that solved, skepticism forever, and now we can be sure about all, sure that our knowledge is truly knowledge. Well, he does have some statues, probably somewhere. But here's why foundationalism kind of falls apart. And again, this is pretty quick, because there's an entire course on epistemology, but here's the quick version of the fall of classic foundationalism. Somewhat ironically, it ends up limiting us to very little knowledge. Why? Well, if all we can have are infallible beliefs at the foundation, there doesn't seem to be enough that we can deduce from this to create a large body of knowledge. So, kind of problem one is, even if we do say, okay, self-evident truths, we'll allow it. There are these. There don't seem to be a lot of them. And so the problem is, if you just get a few of these, then how do you build up all the rest? Now, as Descartes noted, and most foundationalists take this view, empirical beliefs can't be knowledge, because they can always be wrong. And if we can be wrong, we can't have certainty, and if certainty is our standard, then we can't know this stuff, because it's not certain. So that creates a bit of a problem, because we set our standards very high to try to beat the skeptic, because their goal is certainty, But then we end up with such few things that we know. To use an analogy, it'd be like if you were creating, say, a new startup, and you wanted the very best people, and you insisted on getting people with, say, minimum of 3 PhDs, and you needed them to be able to work long hours tirelessly. So you needed them to be, say, Olympian endurance athletes, or at least have competed in like major endurance events, placing high in the New York Marathon or, in Ironman competitions. Now, of course, if you had those standards, you'd get some really great people. Someone with multiple PhDs, having competed at, at the Olympic level, they'd probably be pretty impressive people. But the problem is you're not going to find too many of those people. So you're probably not going to be able to get many of them working for you, if any. So kind of the paradox here is, if the standards are set very high so that you can be certain, you're not going to get that much that's certain. You're not going to get enough beliefs. Now, there are ways to counter this. For example, Leibniz thought that for these basic beliefs, he could use deduction to get everything. So did Descartes. He thought, yeah, this could work. The problem, though, is that, as far as we know, no one showed how that's going to work. No one said, okay, here's our absolutely certain basic beliefs, here's our deduction working away, and boom, there we go. But that is a possibility. Another bit of irony is this. Somewhat ironically and paradoxically, when we have a standard of certainty, then the problem is this. If we say, okay, you don't know unless you're certain, then the skeptic is handed, again, sort of ironically, a great tool. Because a skeptic can always say, whenever someone says, oh, I know this, the skeptic can say, but are you certain? Are you certain about the external world? And to be honest, you have to say, no. And if you say, well, we got this belief about other minds, and the skeptic can say, but are you certain? And of course, you have to say, no. And then even with induction, oh, we got this inductive logic, it's really cool. And the skeptic can just say, are you certain? And of course, you have to say, no. And so by setting the standards that high, the skeptic, in a way, has an easier chance to win. Because if you, trying to say we have knowledge, need absolute certainty, all he's got to show is, or she, show that there's just the possibility of doubt. So the skeptics get it pretty easy. Now, because of this, most contemporary foundationalists, people who are alive today, gave up on classical foundationalism. Going back to the business analogy, imagine someone's got their startup and like, yes, we're going to get minimum 3 PhDs. They got to be Olympic endurance athletes. They got to be the greatest. And then they wait and wait, and no one calls, no one emails. And they say, well, we got to lower our standards. And that's kind of what happened. They wanted these perfect, certainty, didn't get it. And, if you can't get what you really want, I guess you just gotta settle. So what does settling look like with foundationalism? Well, it's called moderate foundationalism, and it's the settling version of foundationalism. So what they do is this. It is foundationalism, so it does use that model. There's basic beliefs, non-basic beliefs. And it was created in an attempt to address the problems of classic foundationalism. Now, as we saw, the problems with classic foundationalism were sort of ironically that its standards were really high. So modern foundationalism says, hey, we can solve this by rejecting the possibility of having infallible beliefs as a system. So they embrace what's called fallibilism. And that's a theory that even the beliefs we love the most could be false. Which, as we'll see, sorry, spoiler alert, this opens up the obvious fatal weakness that, you could always be wrong about stuff. And the skeptic can just say, hey, you can always be wrong about stuff. So what are the features of this modest foundationalism, which has already been defeated? Well, first, like classic foundationalism, it's asymmetrical. So the foundations justify the superstructure, but not vice versa. Unlike classical foundationalism, they do allow doubts about psychological beliefs being indubitable. Now, many classic foundationalists like to point to beliefs that are supposed to be incorrigible, not in the sense that they've done crimes and you can never redeem them, but in the sense that they're, pretty roughly, when you have them, they've got to be true. They can't be shown to be untrue. And one classic example would be like being in pain. Now, you could be wrong about being injured. So a person may think that they were, hurt, but they weren't. It's all in their mind. But the idea is they can't be wrong that they feel pain. They could be mistaken about the cause, the severity of the injury, or that there's no injury at all. But the idea is that if you feel pain, you can't be wrong. But the modern foundationalists, for various reasons, said, yes, you can doubt those. Also, the classic foundationalists, they're kind of elitist. They held that there's only certain special beliefs that can be foundational. But the modern foundationalist says, hey, almost any belief can be basic for a particular person under the right circumstances. Like the song lyric, they're not perfect, but they're perfect for, the person, which is total misquote of the song. But anyways. So no particular type of content is required, and no beliefs are sort of like elite special beliefs. Now, the foundational relationship is one of justification rather than knowing, but again, the ultimate goal is, knowledge. Now, another thing the modern foundationalists allow, which the classics would not, is that they allow for induction. Now, of course, that's a fatal weakness as well, because, as you might recall from argument basics, an inductive argument is such that even if the reasoning is as good as it gets, even if all the premises are true, an inductive argument can always have all true premises and a false conclusion. That is the curse of induction, or the problem of induction. So as soon as they say that, the skeptic can just say, oh, you're allowing inductive reasoning. That means you can always be wrong. So kind of a problem. They also allow coherence. The idea is that if a belief set is incoherent, it can't be justified. But there is a danger point here as well. If they accept and say, hey, let's accept some coherence, then that opens the door to being non-foundational. Now, they also address the problem that arises in epistemology. If you take a class in epistemology, you'll see more of this, is there is a distinction between having a justification for a belief, that's to say your belief is justified, and being able to show that you have that justification. To use a dumb analogy, imagine that you're, think of like security areas, and imagine that you can't show that you should be allowed in the security area because you don't have like your card, but you do have the clearance. Not a great analogy, but kind of the idea. Now, getting back to the belief thing, here's the idea. There could be cases where your belief is justified, but you don't know that it is. And this debate in epistemology is between two general camps. It seems like there's always two camps. One camp says, in order to know, you've got to know your justification, or at least be aware of it. You've got to be able to say, I believe this, I hold it to be true, here's my justification. Another view is, you just have to believe it, and there has to be a justification, but you don't have to be aware of that. To use another terrible analogy, kind of think of like money. If you have money that's legitimate money, you don't have to be able to prove that your money is legitimate. That's not up to you. It's just legitimate for, being proper currency. And so for the moderate foundationalists, they don't require that you have to prove that your belief is justified. So it would have to be justified, but you don't have to be able to show it. So you may have no idea whether your belief is justified or not, but for the moderate foundationalists, you could still know it, because it could still be justified. So what are the problems then with moderate foundationalism? Now, we saw with the classical foundationalism, ironically, it was too strong. The requirements were too high. Again, to use another analogy, it could be like someone, looking to date, and they have incredibly high standards, which would be great. I mean, to find someone that meets incredibly high standards, but if they're impossibly high, there's going to be no one that meets them. And so the solution, again, is settling. So what are the problems with settling in terms of foundationalism, not like the social stuff? Well, the problem is, not surprisingly, is that whereas classical foundationalism was too strong, so the standards were too high, modern foundationalism is too weak. It doesn't provide a strong enough justification for knowledge. And it seems the skeptic can beat it super easily. How so? Well, I went through how so. For example, allowing induction. The skeptic can just say, oh, you got induction, do you? Oh, you could be wrong about everything. And allowing that, for the possibility of fallibility, that you could be wrong. The skeptic is just say, oh, look, you could be wrong. And the skeptic wins. Another problem is the coherentism. As it, engages and accepts coherentism, it seems to move away foundationalism to coherentism, which doesn't prove that it's wrong. It's just you can't say that you're a foundationalist if you accept coherentism. And so it would seem that foundationalism has failed. But maybe coherentism can save the day. And obvious spoiler, it does not.